It was a warm summer afternoon in Maplewood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood where families often gathered for picnics, joggers made their rounds, and children played freely on the playground. The air was filled with the familiar sounds of laughter and birds chirping. Among the many faces that frequented the park was Emily, a middle-aged white woman with neatly styled hair and a demeanor that often reflected an air of entitlement. Dressed in designer activewear, she liked to think of herself as someone who belonged here, someone who felt safe in her familiar surroundings. By the way, I'm curious, where are you watching this video from? Let me know in the comments below. As she strolled through the park that day, sipping her iced coffee, her gaze fell on a man sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. He was dressed in a simple but neat shirt and slacks, his posture relaxed, and his attention focused on the book in his hands. Emily's steps slowed, as her eyes lingered on him a little too long. A sense of unease crept into her mind. The man was black, and she didn't recognize him from the usual crowd she encountered here. Her heart began to race, though there was no real reason for alarm. What is he doing here, she thought to herself. She glanced around, half expecting to see someone else nearby, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The longer she watched him, the more her discomfort grew. He wasn't doing anything, just reading, but something about his presence made her feel uneasy. She told herself it was the way he sat so confidently in a place she felt he didn't belong. As Emily passed by him, her eyes darted between her phone and the man on the bench. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and her mind began to conjure up scenarios. What if he was dangerous? What if he was waiting for the right moment to do something? She bit her lip, her anxiety building. By the time she reached the edge of the park, she had convinced herself that she needed to do something. In her mind, it was better to be safe than sorry. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, as she dialed the local police department. The operator's voice came through the line, calm and professional. 911. What's your emergency? Emily's voice wavered with false urgency as she replied, There's a man in Maplewood Park. I'm not sure what he's doing, but he's been sitting there for a while. He just doesn't look like he belongs here. I feel uncomfortable. Can you send someone to check it out? The operator asked a few more questions, but Emily's mind was already racing, imagining the situation escalating. As she hung up, she glanced back toward the bench. The man still hadn't moved, oblivious to the attention he was drawing. Emily's pulse quickened. She was certain she had done the right thing. A few minutes later, Daryl, the man sitting on the bench, glanced up from his book. He had been engrossed in the pages, enjoying the serenity of the park after a long week of work. Daryl was a doctor, well respected in his field, and he cherished moments like these when he could escape the stresses of his profession. Today had been especially peaceful. The quiet sounds of nature, the occasional laughter of children playing nearby, it was exactly what he needed to recharge. As he stretched his legs and returned his attention to the book, he heard the distant sound of police sirens approaching. A slight frown crossed his face. Strange, he thought. It wasn't often that there was any trouble in this area. Maplewood Park was known for being quiet and safe, a place where people rarely had reason to worry. He brushed off the thought and continued reading, unaware of what was about to unfold. The sirens grew louder, and soon, 2 police cars pulled up near the park entrance. Daryl glanced up again, his brow furrowing in confusion. Why were they here? He watched as 2 officers stepped out of the car, scanning the park before walking in his direction. His first thought was that there must have been some kind of incident, maybe an emergency with one of the kids on the playground. But when the officers made their way toward him, he felt a knot form in his stomach. The first officer, a tall man with a serious expression, approached with his hand resting on the radio at his side. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone firm but professional. "We received a call about a suspicious person in the park. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Daryl blinked in surprise. "A suspicious person? I'm just sitting here reading a book." His voice remained calm, but inside, frustration and confusion began to simmer. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner before responding. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" Daryl paused, realizing what this was. He had been through this before. It was always the same. Someone saw a black man in a predominantly white space, and suddenly, he was a threat. He sighed, reaching into his pocket to pull out his wallet, careful to move slowly so as not to escalate the situation. "Here you go," he said, handing the officer his driver's license. The officer looked at it for a moment, then back at Daryl. There was an awkward silence as the officer continued his questioning. "What brings you to this park today?" Daryl's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. "I live nearby. I come here to relax after work. Is that a crime?" Before the officer could respond, a small crowd had started to gather at a distance. Some watched curiously, while others whispered among themselves. And there, standing near the entrance, was Emily, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She felt a small pang of guilt, but quickly pushed it aside. "This is what needed to happen," she told herself. "I was just being cautious." As the officers continued their questioning, Daryl could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just about the questions. It was the underlying assumption that he was guilty of something simply for being in a public space. He had seen this narrative play out countless times. Stories of innocent men like him being harassed for simply existing in places others thought they didn't belong. He maintained his calm, though his voice grew firmer. "Officer, I've shown you my ID. I'm just here to read. I'm not doing anything wrong." The second officer, a younger woman, shifted her stance slightly. She seemed less sure of the situation, but followed the lead of her partner. "We're just following up on a call, sir. Someone reported feeling uncomfortable with your presence here," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Daryl looked between the two officers, his frustration barely contained. "Uncomfortable?" he repeated, incredulity creeping into his voice. "Because I'm sitting in a park reading? Would you be asking these questions if I didn't look the way I do?" The first officer stiffened slightly, clearly aware of the direction the conversation was heading. "Sir, this isn't about race. We're just doing our job." Daryl shook his head, his voice quieter now, though the tension in his words was palpable. "Maybe not to you, but it sure feels that way from where I'm standing." By now, more people had gathered around, whispering amongst themselves. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Emily, still standing near the park's entrance, started to feel a knot of discomfort in her stomach as she watched. This wasn't how she imagined it would go. She had expected a quick confirmation that her suspicion was correct, that the police would find something wrong. But now, seeing Daryl standing there, calm and dignified, answering their questions with composure, she started to doubt herself. "Maybe I overreacted," she thought, her fingers tightening around her phone. But then she glanced around, hoping for some validation from the crowd. Surely, she wasn't the only one who had felt uneasy about him being here. Suddenly, one of the officers' radios crackled to life. The sound broke the tense silence that had settled over the small crowd. The first officer glanced down at it, and then looked back at Daryl, who stood there, eyes steady, waiting. "All right, everything checks out," the officer said after a moment, handing Daryl back his ID. "Sorry for the trouble. You're free to go." There was a beat of silence as Daryl pocketed his ID, his expression unreadable. He took a slow breath, his gaze flicking briefly to Emily, who quickly averted her eyes. Without another word, Daryl turned and gathered his things, prepared to leave this whole ordeal behind him. Just as Daryl began to walk away, the second officer called out to him, her voice hesitant but curious. "Wait a minute. Your name is Dr. Henderson, isn't it? The same Dr. Henderson who runs the free health clinic downtown?" Daryl paused, turning back toward the officers. He gave a small, tired nod. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his tone restrained, but polite. The younger officer's face softened in recognition. "I've heard about your work. My cousin actually went to your clinic last year when she couldn't afford treatment. She always speaks highly of you. You've done a lot for this community." Daryl gave her a brief, modest smile. "I'm just trying to do my part," he said quietly, though there was a note of weariness in his voice. The first officer's demeanor shifted as well, his earlier stiffness replaced by a look of mild discomfort. It was clear that he, too, was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "We didn't realize. I'm sorry about all this," he muttered, his earlier confidence replaced by an awkward apology. Daryl simply nodded, though he didn't linger on the apology. He had heard it before, from others in positions of power, who never realized they were part of a larger problem until it was too late. "No harm done," he said, though there was an undeniable heaviness in his words. From her spot near the entrance, Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Dr. Henderson?" The name echoed in her mind, bringing with it a flood of recognition. She had heard of him. Everyone had. He was the man who had opened several clinics across the city, offering health care to those who couldn't afford it. Her sister had even mentioned him once, praising his work after attending a community fundraiser. The realization hit her like a wave, and with it came a deep, sinking feeling of guilt. She had called the cops on a man who had dedicated his life to helping others, simply because she had felt uncomfortable with his presence. Her assumptions, her fears, had led to this. She stood there, frozen, as the crowd around her began to disperse. Daryl turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps deliberate. He didn't look at her as he passed, but she felt the weight of his presence nonetheless, the weight of her own actions. As Daryl walked away, Emily stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning. The world around her seemed to blur, and all she could focus on was the sinking feeling in her chest. Her gaze followed Daryl's retreating figure, each of his steps echoing her growing sense of regret. She thought back to the call she had made, the panic in her voice, the certainty that she was doing the right thing. But was it? What had he really done to deserve her suspicion? Sat on a park bench? Read a book? She felt foolish now, realizing how her own biases had clouded her judgment. In her mind, the justification she had given herself began to crumble. She had been so sure, so convinced that her discomfort was valid, that it warranted involving the police. Now in the aftermath, all she felt was shame. She had put a good man, a respected man, through unnecessary scrutiny and humiliation simply because of the color of his skin. The weight of her realization pressed down on her, leaving her feeling small. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled slightly as the reality of what she had done set in. She glanced around, hoping that no one had noticed her, that she could somehow slip away from the scene without anyone realizing she was the one who had made the call. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew that wouldn't change what had happened. She had done this. Her legs felt weak, but Emily took a deep breath and willed herself to move. The police officers were now walking back to their cars, the crowd had mostly dispersed, and the park had returned to its quiet calm. But for Emily, nothing felt calm anymore. In that moment, she made a decision. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let her actions go unchecked without acknowledging the harm she had caused. It wouldn't fix what had happened, but she knew she needed to make it right, at least as much as she could. Her feet felt heavy as she began to walk in the direction Daryl had gone. Each step felt like an admission of her guilt, but she knew she couldn't walk away from this without facing him. Daryl was already near the park exit when Emily caught up to him. Her voice, small and shaky, broke through the quiet. "Excuse me, Dr. Henderson?" He turned, his expression unreadable as he looked at her. For a moment, Emily thought about retreating, about letting her shame swallow her whole and simply walking away. But the look in Daryl's eyes was steady, patient, and she knew she had to continue. Her voice wavered as she spoke, her words tumbling out in a rush. I'm so sorry. I didn't know who you were, but that's no excuse. I should have never called the police. I was wrong, and I realize that now." Daryl didn't respond immediately. His silence hung in the air, but it wasn't hostile. It was thoughtful, as though he were weighing her words carefully before replying. Finally, he let out a quiet sigh, his eyes softening slightly. "It's not about knowing who I am," Daryl said gently, though his words were heavy with meaning. "It's about why you felt the need to call in the first place." Emily's face flushed with shame, and she nodded, her eyes dropping to the ground. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with regret. I don't know why I felt like that. It was wrong. I shouldn't have assumed anything." Daryl remained calm, but his gaze didn't falter. "It's something a lot of people do," he said quietly. "It's something I've dealt with my whole life. but it's not right. You have to understand that your assumptions, your fear, they don't just affect you, they can put others in real danger. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she realized the full gravity of his words. What if things had gone differently? What if the police hadn't recognized him, hadn't treated the situation with care? She swallowed hard, the guilt feeling almost too much to bear. "I know," she repeated, her voice breaking. "I promise I'll do better. I'll learn from this. I'll think before I act next time." Daryl watched her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "That's all anyone can ask," he said quietly. "But it's important that you remember it. Words and actions, they have consequences." Emily wiped her eyes, nodding again, her heart pounding with the weight of his words. She wasn't sure if her apology would ever be enough to erase the harm she had caused, but she knew this was the first step. She had to change, and this moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. Months passed, but the events of that day in the park stayed with Emily. It wasn't something she could forget, nor did she want to. That moment had changed her in a way she hadn't expected, confronting her own biases, her own privilege, and the consequences of her actions had shaken her to her core. But it was more than just the realization of her mistake. It was the conversation with Daryl that had left the deepest impact. His calm, his grace, and his refusal to be bitter in the face of her ignorance had humbled her in a way she hadn't thought possible. He hadn't simply forgiven her, he had given her the opportunity to reflect, to grow, and to do better. Emily's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was real. She became more involved in her community, volunteering with local organizations that focused on racial justice and equality. She attended workshops on implicit bias, challenging herself to unlearn the fears and stereotypes that had been ingrained in her over the years. She started conversations with her friends and family, difficult as they were, about the ways they viewed the world and how those views affected others. But most of all, Emily listened. She listened to the stories of people who had lived through the kinds of experiences Daryl had. She listened to the voices that had been ignored for too long, voices calling for change, for justice, for understanding. And with each story she heard, with each lesson she learned, she became more aware of the responsibility she carried, not just as an individual, but as part of a larger system that had allowed these injustices to exist. Daryl, too, continued his work at the clinic, serving the community with the same humility and compassion that had defined him long before that day in the park. He didn't dwell on the incident, but he carried it with him as a reminder of the work still left to be done. He knew that the fight against prejudice and injustice was ongoing, but he also knew that change was possible, one person at a time. One day, months later, Emily returned to Maplewood Park. The air was crisp, and the familiar sounds of laughter and nature surrounded her. She sat down on the same bench where Daryl had sat that day, a book in her hands, much like the one he had been reading. As she looked around the park, she noticed the diversity of people, their different faces, backgrounds, and stories. But instead of feeling fear or suspicion, she felt a sense of connection, of shared humanity. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that the journey she had begun was far from over, but also knowing that she was on the right path. And as she sat there, under the shade of the oak tree, she thought about the lesson Daryl had taught her, a lesson she would carry with her always. True change starts within, and it's never too late to open your eyes and see the world, and the people in it, differently. In the end, it wasn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. It was about learning, growing, and committing to being better every single day.